There was something in those ancient stones, something that persisted despite the ruins, like a fossilized whisper that refused to die. They said Rome remembered everything, even what it tried to bury under centuries of silence. And it is in this silence that this story begins. The story of a ritual that should never be uttered. If you're fascinated by dark stories, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Ultimately, some traditions only survive when there is someone willing to listen to them. The protagonist of this narrative, let's call him Lucius Verus, a young patrician born on the border between privilege and ruin, believed he knew the customs of his city well. He had grown up among marble columns, listening to recitations about civic virtues, military glories, and Rome's inevitable destiny to dominate the world. But, like many elite Romans, Lucius had only scratched the surface of his own culture. There were deeper layers so ancient that not even the Senate dared mention them. It was the year he was finally supposed to get married. In Rome, marriage was not merely a union between two people. It was a political contract, a cog in the social machine. For the patricians, it was a public spectacle. Solemn oaths, banquets, offerings to the household gods. Purity rituals. Lucius knew all this. He also knew that his family demanded haste. His father's legacy was threatened by debts and unstable alliances. The union with Cornelia Alia, descendant of an austere and feared lineage, he could restore the honor of the Ver. But what no one mentioned, not aloud, was that Cornelia's family carried a mark, a tradition as old as the first huts on the Palatine Hill. A custom that had spanned generations and, over time, had been prohibited, persecuted, and almost entirely extinguished. It all began to insinuate itself into the air weeks before the ceremony. Lucius was sensitive to invisible disturbances, to the vibrations that permeate a house when something is not right. He felt watched, even when he was alone. He found small amulets hidden under pillows, bone fragments deliberately left on doorsteps, fingernail marks on soft wood. When he questioned his mother, he received only a heavy look and silence. When he asked his father, he heard the answer that should never have been uttered. Some marriages are still governed by agreements that predate the Republic itself. This tormented Lucius. Pax predating the Republic. What could have existed before the laws that shaped Rome? What kind of ritual had survived clandestinely, passed from mother to daughter, from father to daughter, from generation to generation? And why did no one dare mention it? The public ceremony, at least, seemed normal. The city was restless. That morning the wind carried dust and the smell of rain, and the forum flags fluttered with unusual violence. As was the custom, Lucius was to fetch the bride from her home, then lead her to the Varro residence, where the union would be formalized before witnesses and gods. The guests gathered before the Alia house, an imposing structure whose austere facade concealed a dark, almost funereal inner courtyard. The women wore light tunics and heavy veils, the men crowns of dry leaves, as if even the vegetation there had been drained of life. Nothing shone in their eyes, no smiles, no gesture of cordiality. It was as if they all carried a silent knowledge, something that could not, under any circumstances, be told to Lucius. When Cornelia appeared, she brought an indescribable discomfort. She was beautiful, yes austere, dignified, with a firm posture, but her eyes held a disturbing depth, as if they observed more than the surface of things. Lucius felt a chill run down his spine when she extended her hand to him. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice low, almost muffled. He wanted to answer with conviction, but the surrounding silence seemed to press against his chest. The procession began. The crowd murmured along, offering formal blessings and vows of fertility. But along the way, Lucius began to notice details that shouldn't be there. Hooded figures watching from the shadows, symbols scratched with charcoal on the walls of the insula, a sweet and unpleasant aroma emanating from incense burning in the street corners. As they progressed, the public part of the ceremony began to dissolve into an increasingly oppressive atmosphere. The occasional laughter from the guests seemed out of place. Forced, the shadows seemed to lengthen faster than the sun's position would allow. Lucius felt his heart race with an anxiety he didn't understand. But everyone said marriage was a rite of passage. Nervousness was expected. Was it? When they arrived at the Varro house, a crowd awaited in the atrium. The scent of dried flowers filled the air. The walls were adorned with red fabrics the color of life, of union, and also, in certain circles, of death. Lucius saw his father, rigid as a statue, his gaze fixed on his bride as if trying to decipher an omen. The public ceremony proceeded according to protocol. The bride feigned reluctance, symbolizing the ancient tradition of ritual abduction. The groom offered water and fire. Witnesses confirmed the union. The priest chanted archaic formulas that few fully understood. But something was wrong. The priest, an elderly man chosen by Cornelia's family, spoke with a somber tone, as if each word carried hidden meanings. And then, the public ceremony ended. The guests retired to the banquet. The music began to break the silence, and the atmosphere finally seemed to relax. But Lucius noticed that Cornelia wasn't going to the party. Instead, she was walking slowly towards a side corridor, where the light from the lamps flickered as if fighting against an invisible wind. She turned and gestured for him to follow her. No one tried to stop them. No one asked anything. It was as if everyone knew. As Lucius walked behind her, the lively conversations of the banquet faded into the distance, as if the sound were being swallowed by the walls. The corridor narrowed, and the scent of dried flowers gave way to another something metallic, bittersweet. He felt chills run down his arms, a primal instinct warning him that this was no place for the living. Cornelia stopped before an old, dark wooden door, marked with deep scars. Above it, a circular symbol seemed to have been hastily scraped off, as if someone had tried to erase it. But the mark remained visible, persistent, almost pulsating. The public wedding. Cornelia sighed, turning slowly. Is only the surface. For some families, the true union takes place here. Her voice was devoid of emotion. It was almost an enigma. Lucius's heart was pounding so hard he could barely think. Part of him wanted to retreat, to flee that suffocating corridor. But another part, driven by curiosity, duty, or destiny, remained steadfast. Cornelia opened the door. The air that escaped from within was cold, dense, and ancient. An air that seemed to have been sealed for generations. The lamps inside were few, and their light barely touched the walls, which were covered with symbols so ancient they seemed to predate Roman writing. In the center of the room, there was an object covered by a dark cloak, and around it, small motionless figures. They were not alone. Lucius felt a prickling sensation on his skin, as if invisible fingers were brushing against his neck. Cornelia entered and gestured for him to follow. As he crossed the threshold, he realized this was no ordinary room. It was a ritualistic chamber, secretly preserved for centuries. The figures around the central object moved their heads slowly, as if awakening from a trance. And then Cornelia spoke, for the first time with true gravity. What is about to happen is what Rome tried to erase. But in our lineages, nothing truly dies. Lucius felt the weight of the shadows upon him. The ritual, the one no one mentioned, the one that only existed in rumors buried by history, was about to be revealed, and there was no turning back. The silence within that chamber was so thick it felt like it weighed on someone's head. Lucius, breathing heavily, felt the cold air slide across his skin as if the room itself breathed with him or against him. The figures around the covered object slowly raised their faces, revealing more clearly what they were. Older members of the Aliyah family, men and women, with rigid features, marked by deep lines, carved not only by time, but by generations of secrecy. Cornelia approached the center of the room, her soft steps echoing like blows on a hollow board. The dark cloak covering the central object was removed with a slow, ritualistic movement. Beneath it, an ancient wooden structure emerged, decorated with strips of dried leather, polished bones, and small bronze discs engraved with Etruscan symbols that predated Rome. Symbols that history itself sought to forget. Lucius felt his body tremble. The object was a wedding bed. The ritualistic wedding bed, but not like those used in ordinary ceremonies. This one was narrower, more rigid, almost an altar, and what lay upon it made Lucius's stomach clench. A clay figure, female, with empty eyes and a mouth sewn shut with dark thread. She wore a red veil, as vivid as fresh blood. Cornelia did not seem disturbed. On the contrary, her expression was serene. Helmost, This is the ancient simulacrum, she said, lightly running her fingers over the figure. She will witness our union, as she has for every couple in my lineage done, since before Rome was Rome. Lucius swallowed hard. His mind searched for references, explanations, any academic fragment that would make sense of it. He vaguely remembered Etruscan rituals that combined funerary elements with wedding ceremonies, as if marriage were also a pact with the dead, but nothing, absolutely nothing compared to what he saw before him. The figures around him began to chant a low, deep melody, almost a collective snort. It wasn't Latin. It wasn't Greek. It was something more archaic, a language that seemed to vibrate in Lucius's bones, as if it had been created before any written record. Cornelia gestured for him to come closer to the ritual bed. Lucius, she said, her voice echoing with a weight it hadn't had before. You need to understand why this ritual existed and why Rome tried to erase it. The lamps flickered, casting shadows that snaked across the walls. Before the Republic, she continued, some families believed that the union between two houses was not just a social contract, but a spiritual pact. The bride was not given only to the husband, but to all his ancestors, and the groom, in turn, was offered to the guardian spirits of the bride. Lucius felt a cold shiver run down the back of his neck. But over time, she continued, the Senate declared certain rituals to be nefarious superstition, a mixture of religion, magic, and blood. They sought to eradicate them. Some disappeared, but others survived. In hiding, Cornelia's eyes locked onto his, intense and penetrating. Ours, she said, is one of those. Lucius felt his legs weaken for a moment. Part of his mind insisted that this was madness, delirium, dead superstition, but the atmosphere of the room, the way the air seemed to vibrate, the solemn expression of those present, none of it seemed staged. Cornelia extended her hand to him. Come. The ritual needs to begin. Lucius looked around. Everyone was watching him. There was no hostility, only expectation, as if he were a final piece needed to complete an ancient machine. He took a deep breath and moved forward. When her hand touched Cornelia's, something changed in the room. The deep melody chanted by the elders became more intense, deeper. One of the women approached with a small, curved blade knot, sharp like a weapon, but like a ceremonial instrument. The blade had inscriptions that resembled serpents and circles. She offered the instrument to Cornelia. Lucius took a half-step back. No, Cornelia said softly. Don't be afraid. Nothing that happens here is meant to hurt you. But his eyes revealed another truth. Nothing would happen there without something being taken. Cornelia raised the blade and, with a quick and delicate movement, made a small cut on her own finger. A drop of blood trickled down and settled on the forehead of the clay figure. The elders raised their arms in unison. The melody became a chant, rhythmic, hypnotic. The blade was then offered to Lucius. Hesitate. All her upbringing, her beliefs, her logic screamed against it. But the room seemed to contract around her, as if refusing her refusal. Her fingers trembled as they finally accepted the instrument. A simple gesture, just a small cut. It wasn't painful, but when the drop of her blood fell beside Cornelia's, on the figure's forehead, something happened. An invisible wind blew into the room, briefly extinguishing one of the lamps. The air seemed heavier, denser. The clay figure, for an instant, seemed to tremble, not a clear movement, but a sensation in the corner of the eye, a glimmer of impossible life. The elders began to murmur words more rapidly, as if reciting formulas that could not be interrupted. Cornelia turned to Lucius and touched his face with both hands. Now you understand, she said. For us, marriage is not a union between the living. It's a union between lineages, between memories, between those who came before and those who will come after. She took the blade again and, this time, cut a strand of her own hair, placing it on the chest of the clay figure. She motioned for Lucius to do the same. He did, his trembling hand placing the strand on the simulacrum. The entire room seemed to sigh, and then the climax of the ritual began. Cornelia climbed onto the ritual bed, kneeling beside the figure. Lucius, hesitant, was guided to the other side. Between them, the simulacrum seemed to gain presence, not life. but an almost palpable spiritual weight. The elders chanted the final sequence of songs. The shadows on the walls lengthened, taking on distorted shapes, like arms reaching for something. The lamps swayed violently. Cornelia held Lucius's hands. "From this moment on," she said, "our lineages become indivisible. Our dead will walk together. Our destinies will be one." Lucius didn't know whether it terrified or fascinated him. His heart was pounding, but there was something different now, feeling that invisible forces surrounded him, watched him. The elders pronounced the final formula. Old blood, one memory, eternal marriage, and then silence, an absolute silence, as if the world had held its breath. The ritual was complete. Cornelia collapsed slightly onto her knees, exhausted. Lucius, sweating profusely, felt something inside him shift as if he had been touched by something that did not belong to the physical world. He was married, but not in the way Rome would recognize it, not in a way that no citizen should ever have to experience. The forbidden ritual was complete, and his soul no longer belonged entirely to him. For a long moment after the ritual ended, Lucius couldn't move. The room seemed to spin slowly and heavily, as if the walls breathed to the rhythm of something very ancient that had awakened. The clay figured the simulacrum remained, motionless between him and Cornelia, but its presence was now different, almost menacing. Lucius felt, watched. Not by the elders, not by Cornelia, but by something that now seemed to inhabit the empty space between the visible and the invisible. Cornelia gently touched his hand. "It is done," he murmured. "We are one. Beyond time." Lucius didn't answer. He couldn't. His body obeyed, but his mind wandered through hazy territories, trying to comprehend exactly what had happened there. Something within him had been broken or completed, he couldn't say. The only certainty was that nothing would ever be the same again. When they left the ritual chamber, the party in the atrium had already subsided. The voices of the guests echoed distantly, muffled by the thick walls of the house. Lucius walked as if submerged in water, each step heavy, each breath weaker than the last. He felt something inside him, like a slight pressure in his chest, a silent and constant presence. Cornelia understood. "Don't fight it," she said as they walked down the hallway. "Our rituals have always been meant to unite, not to destroy." Unite. The word echoed within him like a deep whisper. Union. Connection. Between the living and the dead, between lineages, between memories. Lucius felt a shiver run down his arms. It was as if invisible threads stretched from the chamber to his bones, binding him to something greater, something he hadn't fully consented to, but which, somehow, had accepted him. Upon reaching the lobby, some people were still drinking wine or conversing in small groups, but no one seemed to notice the change in Cornelia or Lucius. Perhaps the ritual was so secret, so hidden, that no one ever dared mention it. Perhaps they pretended not to know, or perhaps they truly believed that nothing extraordinary had happened. Lucius noticed, however, that the eyes of some older men, probably distant relatives of Cornelia, were watching him with a silent respect. Not a cordial respect, but a ritualistic recognition, as if he now belonged to an invisible circle. And then, among the shadows at the back of the atrium, he saw his father. Old Varro's gaze, once filled with concern and authority, was now somber. There was fear in it, and guilt. Lucius approached. "Dad!" Her voice came out weak. The father took a deep breath and looked away for a moment, as if his son's mere presence revealed mistakes he preferred not to revisit. "I wish to avoid this," the old man said finally, "but I had no choice." "Avoid what?" The father stared at him, and his eyes were filled with tears. "The debt, Lucius. I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about pacts. Ancient ones. Very ancient. Your mother and I tried to keep you away from them, but families, bloodlines, always exact their price." Lucius felt a deep nausea. "Did you know about the ritual?" The father nodded slowly. "I knew there was something. But the details are lost, because Rome itself tries to erase them. Nobody wants to remember the times when marriage was a spiritual pact, when families united not only lands, but their ancestral memories. When the dead had a voice, Lucius felt his blood run cold. There's something inside me. Old Varro's gaze faltered. There will be, my son. There always will be. That's the price of the union they preserve. That's why Rome forbade it. That's why they tried to bury these practices. But some houses haven't forgotten. Lucius staggered away. Each word from his father weighed like lead. Part of him wanted to run away, to abandon Cornelia, to abandon Rome, to abandon everything. But another part, or newly awakened part, felt trapped, anchored by threads he couldn't see. Cornelia reappeared at his side. "Come," she said, holding his wrist. "You need to rest. This night is always difficult for those going through the ritual for the first time." First time. The phrase echoed like thunder. That night, in the bridal chamber, the silence was thick. The lamp flickered as if it were about to go out. Cornelia rested beside him, breathing deeply, serene, almost radiant. Lucius, however, could not sleep, because every time he closed his eyes, he saw something. No clear images, no recognizable faces, but echoes of memories that weren't his own. Hazy scenes of ancient rituals, silent sacrifices, women and men in primitive clothing singing before stone altars. He saw shadows dancing around bonfires. He saw masked figures. He saw centuries compressed into fragments his mind couldn't comprehend. The early morning hours passed as if time had been altered. When the sun finally touched the walls of the room, Lucius rose, pale and exhausted. Cornelia watched him sweetly. "Now you understand," she said. "You are connected to my lineage, and I to yours. The dead walk with us, and they guide us." "This shouldn't exist," Lucius murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "Rome abolished this ritual for a reason." Cornelia smiled, a smile that was both sad and proud at the same time. Rome tried to erase everything it couldn't control. All magic, all superstition, every shadow that reminded us that we are made of more than laws and marble. But some traditions are older than the city itself. They survive because they carry the truth of who we are. Lucius stepped back, distressed. "And what are we?" Cornelia stared intently at him. "Bearers of memories, guardians of pacts. And now, you are one of us." The following weeks were marked by subtle, but irreversible, transformations. Lucius began to notice things. Fragments of thoughts that weren't his own, words and languages they had never learned, perfumes that appeared out of nowhere. And, above all, the constant feeling of being watched by presences that never revealed themselves. He tried to hide them from others, but Cornelia always knew. Around them, Rome continued its pragmatic routine. Trials in the forum, commercial transactions, soldiers marching, priests performing daily sacrifices. No one imagined or admitted that in the confines of ancient houses, forbidden rituals still took place. Gradually, Lucius began to understand why history had tried to erase them. It wasn't just superstition. It was power. If a family maintained spiritual ties with its distant ancestors, if it preserved a bond that not even death could break, then it possessed something that no law could regulate. Such lineages were too dangerous, too untamable. That is why the Senate, centuries before, had decreed such practices as nefarious superstition. That is why collective memory pushed them into oblivion. But forgetting is never complete. Lucius now walked, carrying centuries of shadows. Over time, something unexpected began to happen. He stopped feeling just fear. He began to feel a sense of belonging. The fragments of memory ceased to be disjointed intrusions and became signs, guides, silent advice. Sometimes, when making important decisions, she felt a sudden guidance, something that flowed from a place where past and present met. Her reasoning became more intuitive, deeper. Cornelia said that this was the true legacy of the ritual. The price, however, was not small. He would never again be just an individual. He would never again be just Lucius Varro. It was now a official history. The kind written by chroniclers and preserved on parchment would never mention this ritual. Future generations would believe that Roman marriage was merely a civil act, perhaps with one or two simple superstitions. The dark, ancestral, and spiritual depth of the past would be erased, diluted, masked as legend. But Lucius knew the truth. Cornelia knew the truth, and the shadows that walked with them. Too. Their lives became a silent pact. He learned to live with the presence of the dead, to interpret their signs, to honor the memories he had inherited. Cornelia guided him with patience, and together they became part of something greater than any historical record would allow them to admit. Time passed, and one day, holding the couple's first child in his arms, Lucius understood the extent of his destiny. That child would carry not only blood, but centuries of echoes. He would be a bridge between worlds that Rome pretended did not exist. And, like his parents, he would learn early on that some traditions do not die. Te only ID. Rome could try to erase it. The chroniclers could remain silent. The laws could prohibit it. But certain rituals, especially those linked to marriage, blood, and memory, survive not because they are permitted, but because they are necessary. Lucius lifted the child with trembling hands and, for a moment, felt all the presences around him. They weren't threatening, not anymore. They were like familiar shadows. Guardians. Cornelia touched his shoulder. They are happy, she said. The lineage continues. Lucius took a deep breath, and at that moment, he finally understood the horrifying ritual that Rome tried to erase. For some, it was the last link between the living and their dead. It was terrifying. It was beautiful. It was irrevocable. And, in the eternal twilight of collective memory, it would continue to exist as long as there was someone willing to remember. End.